Hello, I'm Nicholas Henshall. I'm the Vicar of St Thomas's here in Groombridge, and this is the second in the series of Advent talks. Last week we talked about the patriarchs, the first theme of Advent, this season of hope and expectation running up to the birth of Christ at Bethlehem. And last week we were looking at the patriarchs, who are those great foundation stones, so to speak, in the Old Testament of the whole journey of faith right up to today. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, these extraordinary figures from whom came the 12 tribes of Israel and then the whole history of Israel that follows. This week we're talking about the prophets. So what do we need first is probably, well, a health warning really about the word prophet. Now, I try not to get too excited about words, but they are terribly important, especially when we're talking about biblical truth. And one of the real problems for us is that when we hear the word prophet, we immediately think somebody who tells the future. Unfortunately, that is not what the Hebrew word used in the Bible means. What the word prophet in Hebrew, navi is the word, what it means is somebody who looks at the present and basically says, if you carry on like this, there will be consequences, right? So yes, that's about the future, but it's not foretelling the future. There is another word in the Old Testament that we translate seer, one who sees, which are a small group of people in the Old Testament who do have visions of the future. But those are not the prophets as we understand them. They're a totally different band of people. Very rarely does a prophet work as a seer, or a seer as a prophet is one of the tags in this world. So let's recognise from the beginning that the Old Testament prophets are not in the business of foretelling the future. They are not seers, they are prophets. And a prophet, navi in Hebrew, means somebody who looks at the present and says, if you carry on like this, there will be consequences, i.e. the implication is you better change your way of thinking, you better change your way of living, you need to change your values if you are going to avoid disaster. So far, so good. If you want more on this sort of thing, then go to further down in Father Nick Thinking Out Loud, one of the earliest videos there called Introduction to the Book of Micah, which is essentially a deep dive into Old Testament prophecy and the shape of the Old Testament. That's very useful if this is new territory for you. But as I say, you'll find this further down the list of videos on Father Nick Thinking Out Loud. So, prophecy, the prophets. Who are they? What did they do? Well, prophecy in Israel begins sort of almost out of nowhere in the 8th century, BC. Well, you say almost out of nowhere, but it's very clear, of course. By the 8th century BC, the monarchy has been established, King David and so forth. And that's a problem because, as you may remember, when the Jewish people said, we want a king like all the nations, God said, absolutely not. I am your king and you have no other. And then after a bit of argument, argy-bargy, back and forth, and of course the Hebrew Bible does that a great deal, and I think with great guts, God finally said, okay, and this echoes exactly what the prophets are going to say, you can have a king like all the nations, but there will be consequences. And the consequences begin almost immediately. David, the great king, turns out to be a serial adulterer, somebody who fights for the other side against his own people, somebody who sends somebody to murder just so he can actually have a relationship with his wife and so forth. I mean, David's behaviour, the great king, is appalling. And God says, well, okay, it's been a bit of a disaster and I'm going to take the kingdom out of your hands. Except I won't do it now, I'll do it in your son Solomon's time. Oh, so we have the beginning of a big story. And in a sense, it's the big story of the Old Testament, which is God gave us this incredible promise. God gave us the covenant. That's what the Abraham stuff's all about. And we simply failed to fulfill it, our side of the bargain. Well, a covenant isn't a bargain. I said that last week. A covenant is a loving agreement. So there can be no breaking of the covenant exactly. It's just that the people go their own way. And again, it's the focus of the king getting it wrong. So in a sense, you can sum up loads of the Old Testament by going basically good king, bad king, bad king, good king, bad king, bad king, oh, good king, bad king, oh, exile. Come to that in a minute. An 8th century prophecy has its origins precisely there, because what you begin to get is these prophets, remember, not people who see the future, but commentating on the present and warning people of the implications for the future. The prophets, Amos, probably among the earliest, actually looking at what's happening in Israel and saying, this is a disaster. And the focus of Old Testament prophecy is always on social injustice. That's the primary theme that comes through all the prophets in the Old Testament: social injustice. If you are going to beat up the poor, forget their needs, look at the wealthy and say they're marvelous, then you've lost the plot. That is the fundamental message of Isaiah, and the massive book of Isaiah, and indeed most of those early prophets and many of the later ones. You have lost the plot because you do not do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. These are very familiar lines because, of course, we use them regularly in Christian liturgy. So that's what the prophets are doing. Now, there are other kinds of prophets as well, which are worth talking about because they do crop up in the Old Testament. And they're essentially paid prophets attached to shrines or to powerful individuals. Now, we won't have much to do with them because they're really not our focus, although there are bands of prophets roaming around Israel doing, if you like, professional paid prophet work. Sounds a bit weird to us, doesn't it? Well, it certainly sounds weird to me. And in the book of Amos, one of the most powerful prophetic books, whose focus is exactly on, as I said, social justice. Look what you've done. You're depriving the poor. You're forgetting the needs of the needy. You are doing the opposite of what God wants. And Amos says in a very famous verse, I am not a prophet, nor am I a prophet's son. I am a dresser of sycamore trees. Now, that may seem a really odd thing for anybody to say, let alone a prophet. I'm not a prophet. I'm not a prophet's son. I am a dresser of sycamore trees. What on earth is he saying? He was saying, I'm not like those useless bands of prophets, who wander around saying random things and getting paid for it. No, I am not that kind of prophet. I am independent, shall we say. I'm only answerable to God. And that's a very basic and important issue about the prophets. They do not feel answerable to the king, like many prophets did. They do not feel accountable to a local shrine or a local ruler. No, they feel accountable only to God. And their intention is only to speak the words that God reveals to them. And those words, as I've said already, but I couldn't emphasize too much, are always, their authenticity is pretty much always tested by the way in which they speak about inclusion, about hope, about the inclusion of the poor, about the inability of the people as a mass, but often summed up in the name of the king, to actually live justly and deal fairly. Those fundamental obligations that God has entered into with his people through the covenant with Abraham. So far so good. So the prophets that we encounter as named prophets in the Bible are not paid associates of the king or of a shrine or wandering around as a band of prophets, although those groups do appear in the Bible. They're not solo heroes either. They're absolutely rooted in the life of the people of Israel, the life of the temple, and so forth. Although, rather like many modern commentators, they, if you like, stand on the edge as people who are absolutely at the heart of things, but are looking at what's happening and saying to the nation, come off it. This cannot continue. And when they say this cannot continue, what they mean is there will be consequences, and they will be really serious. And from very early on, you get prophets, and Isaiah foremost among them, saying, the temple is going to come to an end if you're not careful. The kingship, it's a disaster. How on earth are we going to we cannot make headway as the kind of people we're meant to be. Of course, later on in Isaiah, we get that wonderful vision where the prophet tells us that the purpose of Israel is to be a shining example to all the nations of the earth, not just to the Jewish people, and that everybody will gather to Jerusalem because it's such a shining example of how to live a righteous life, how to live the way God has promised. But of course, underscoring that is Isaiah's earlier stuff saying, and you've got it wrong. You treat the poor with contempt. You value the wrong values. You do not walk justly. You do not walk humbly with your God. You do not do justice. That's a very big theme. Justice for the poor is absolutely fundamental in the writings of the prophets. Or do I say writings? In the words of the prophets. It's very unlikely that all the prophets wrote down their own words, as we see with Jeremiah, where we actually meet the person who is his scribe, his helper, who writes down his words. So 8th century prophecy, which is a huge part of the prophetic tradition in the Old Testament, and above all the prophet Isaiah, give us a very clear view of what a prophet is. A prophet is unashamed to stand up and say to the people, and even say to the king, you've got it wrong. you have not broken the covenant exactly, because the covenant with God, between God and the people, is unbreakable, as we saw last week with the patriarchs. You haven't broken exactly, but you are not living up to its terms and expectations, fundamentally in failing to address social justice, and not just in a kind of simple way, but your inability to do that is imperiling the whole nation. You are not being righteous, maybe a word we would use there. So that's a summary, really, of what the Old Testament prophets are about. And of course, what happens in 597, 587 BC, so 500 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, you actually see exactly what the prophets have suggested. Disaster strikes. And it strikes from all over the place. So initially, in a few centuries earlier, Samaria is lost to the Assyrians. Jerusalem nearly falls at that point, and then later on, it does fall to the Babylonians. And the later books of the prophets are tragic, because they are describing exactly what they thought was going to happen. Again, not prophecy, not prediction, but precisely this. We know what's going to happen if you don't actually live righteously, and this is the outcome. And the outcome is the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the carting off of most of the people to Babylon, where many of them never come back from. I mean, the darkness there is overwhelming. And you get prophets like Jeremiah. And Jeremiah, we always think of him as sad. I don't think it's sad. I think it's deeply tragic, because Jeremiah chooses to stay in Jerusalem and lives throughout the destruction. And he's nearly killed many times, nearly executed several times, because what does he do? He does what an Old Testament prophet does. He stands up and he says, look, your failure to do what was right has led precisely to this. And frankly, you should be ashamed of yourselves. And of course, the regime does exactly what regimes do everywhere. They try to silence him. They throw him down a pit. They burn his scroll that he's written. They try and throw him out. Eventually, Jeremiah tragically just wanders off to Egypt and never comes back. I mean, it's really, really... Ezekiel, another one of my very favourite prophets, and I've never made a secret of that. Ezekiel, absolutely wild. Even to this day, the first chapter of Ezekiel's book is not allowed to be read in the synagogue, because it's meant to be, it's felt to be so difficult and so misleading. So Ezekiel is a wild prophet. Do not read Ezekiel without a good map and a good instructor, so to speak. But Ezekiel has the same thing. Ezekiel is a bilocating prophet from Jerusalem to Babylon. So he's in touch with both communities, both of which are in a desperate state. And he's trying to say, what sense do we make of this? We thought we were being good people. Oh, don't hear that a lot. I'm a good person. No, you weren't being good people, because you were fundamentally working against God's preferential option for the poor, his love for the outcast, his home for the stranger. These are themes, of course, we know massively in the New Testament, in the teaching of Jesus, and indeed the writings of Paul. This is fundamental in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And Ezekiel very powerfully has this vision of the whole glory of God rising up from the temple and going away. It's all over. And then, of course, at the end of the book of Ezekiel, even though nothing is solved in a sense, he sees the glory returning. And so these prophets have overlapping messages, but their fundamental purpose is again and again, yes, warning about, look at the signs of the times, respond, and particularly respond in terms of social justice. And that is what your Lord requires. Again, something that we hear again and again in our hymns and in our readings. So what do we make of a tradition that sees all the prophets as foretelling the future? Well, as I said at the beginning, that's simply not what the Old Testament says. But, and I think this is really important, because I think this is a deep and significant part of the way Christians understand who they are and how the Old Testament is still our book, so to speak, or our set of books. The Old and the New Testament are set of books. There was a group in early Christianity who said, let's ditch the Old Testament. It's nothing to do with us. And for some time that was very influential, and some Christians still find that very tempting and just ignore all that dark and difficult stuff. But no, says the church, the Old Testament is our Old Testament, not just the Jewish Bible. It is ours. Now, okay, we then rearranged it, and that was probably not helpful. But what do we say then about this link between the Old and the New Testament? It's really important not just to see the Old Testament says this and, oh, look, there it is in the New. That's really not a helpful way of putting it, because I think it's a much deeper thing that's going on. what we get, of course, let's not forget that the Old Testament is the Christian Bible for the first 3 centuries of Christianity. We didn't have another Bible. The New Testament doesn't come together as a collection of books till the 4th century, 300-400 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So what did the early Christians do when they gathered for prayer on a Sunday morning, or indeed any day of the week? They read from the Old Testament. And as time went by, as the Gospels appeared and the letters of Paul, and remember the letters of Paul come before the Gospels, they began to read those as well. But the actual idea of a Christian New Testament is 300-400 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So the first Christians knew their Old Testament backwards. They knew the prophets backwards, and forwards, which is even more helpful. And of course, what happens in early Christian reflection, and you can see this, in some of the early writings of a writer like Origen, one of the great theologians of the Christian church, and Gregory of Nyssa later on. It's one of they read the Old Testament, and a passage like we're going to be reading this coming Sunday, which speaks of a child who's going to be born and save everything. And of course, Isaiah is addressing that to the 8th century Jewish community, feeling hopeless, downcast, and rubbish because everything's gone wrong. And we Christians then read it and say, this has a resonance. Now, resonance is a very important concept, both in theology and in poetry, and indeed in human life. Resonance means something resonates with us. A theme or a piece of, we say it about a piece of music. We hear a piece of music or a sermon or even, and it says, that really resonates with me. I really get it. That has, I kind of know that almost intuitively. And that's how the Old Testament prophets and the New Testament writings link together. So when we hear a child is to be born, we say, we know this story. This is part of our spiritual DNA because Isaiah talked about this in the 8th century. Isaiah wasn't thinking, there's a bloke called Jesus going to be born in a few thousand years and I'll talk about him. No, Isaiah is talking about his moment in the Old Testament. And as Christians, we then have that resonance that we think, we know this story because there is a family likeness between the prophets of the Old Testament and the experience of the Christian church. Maybe a more explicit example of this resonance theme, which I think is so fundamental to Christian readings of the Old Testament, is in the Passion narratives, where, and I've said this before when we did the course running up to Easter, that it's very clear to me, and it seems to me to most people, that what Jesus does on the cross while he is dying is recite the Psalms. That's why we find Jesus quoting the Psalms in Mark's Gospel and in Luke's Gospel in a very explicit way, and in Matthew's Gospel following Mark. The most obvious is when Jesus quotes from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it's a really profound and heart-rending moment. Now, why? So he says that. So we hear him say that. Now, here we have almost a triple resonance, because, of course, those standing at the foot of the cross, some of whom are still his followers, the ones who haven't run away yet, they say, we know this. This is part of our story too. We know this because we know the Psalms. Now, the Psalms are part of our Christian heritage too. They're sung daily or said daily in churches. And they're part of the daily prayer of the church to this very day. And of course, Psalm 22 has that verse in it. My God, why have you forsaken me? A psalm, it would seem, of desolation. But of course, those Christians who then say, this is really important. Gosh, we heard this. We heard this back in the Psalms, these ancient hymns of praise that we've been singing for centuries. And now we know that this has resonance with us because Jesus is claiming these words as his own. Of course, the thing with the Jesus stuff on Psalm 22 is those Matthew and Mark, who are the ones who record, my God, why have you forsaken me, on the words of Jesus, are also assuming that we know the end of that psalm, which is, I will praise you in the great congregation, i.e. a psalm of desolation actually ends as a psalm of praise. That's how resonance works. And again, you can see it in Paul's writings. I won't go down that rabbit hole today. You can certainly see it in the Gospels throughout, and you see it in all sorts of places. A very obvious place where this resonance is very clear, and we touched on this a couple of years ago, is in the book of Revelation, where it's not so much resonance as just straightforward quotation, where great chunks of Revelation are simply lifted from the books of the prophets, above all Ezekiel. Indeed, I've often said you cannot understand the book of Revelation unless you understand the book of the prophet Ezekiel. They are fundamentally connected. And so what you get between, not just between the Old Testament and other books in the Old Testament, or between the New Testament and other books in the New Testament and the Old Testament, is across the scriptures a kind of referencing back and a referencing forward. And that's what resonance is. This is family likeness. We know this. This is part of our DNA. So that's something about prophets. Prophets don't tell the future. They look at the present and warn people there will be implications if you don't actually put justice and mercy at the heart of what you do. And that's why I have Jubilee years. Remember, Jubilee has become rather debased in our culture. Jubilee means a redistribution of lands and property every 70 or so years. Gosh, 49 years? It doesn't matter. I'll do that another time. That's what Jubilee looks like in the Old Testament. It's not just being nice. It's actually fundamental redistribution. Always goes wrong there, always very challenging. So this notion of resonance, that's how it works. It's not it's not foretelling the future, it's commenting on the present and saying there will be consequences. And just to finish off with a few words towards the end of the Old Testament, because while the prophetic tradition in one sense comes to an end in the 5th century, because it's all finished, everything went wrong, it was a disaster. We lost everything. We lost the land, we lost the king, we lost the law, the people have gone into exile. Everything is over. Jerusalem is finished. And then as they begin to come back, and we're talking about the 4th, 3rd century BC, so getting very much closer to the time of Jesus. They come back in dribs and drabs. Many, as I say, never come back to Jerusalem. You get a kind of continuation of prophecy. And almost all of that is for a very traditionalist, shall we use a polite word, traditionalist slant, is the reason God isn't blessing us is because we haven't finished building the temple. And that becomes an overwhelming theme in the later books of the prophets in the Old Testament. Most of the lesser prophets, so to speak, the minor prophets as they're called, focus on that. If we only built the temple again properly, God would bless us again and everything will be right. And of course, that doesn't really work out. And I think one of the things that's fascinating in the Old Testament for Christians is the way we just see that petering out, coming slowly to a stop, somehow around 200 BC. You've got books like Daniel, which date from around that time, which begin to get focused on rather more strange visions and so forth. And then, of course, the last page of the Old Testament in the book of Malachi, again, has a wonderful piece of resonance because the Old Testament ends with someone else is going to come and put all this right. And Christians have read that ever since as John the Baptist. And in a sense, John the Baptist in the New Testament is the last of the prophets because John does exactly what an Old Testament prophet does. He doesn't foretell the future, absolutely not. What John does is he looks at the present in the context of the overwhelming dominion of Rome across Palestine, the impossibility of living freely, the persecution of the people, and the way the people have got lost, so to speak. And John says, this is awful. We need national renewal. Oh dear, I sound like the Reith lectures, don't I? We need national renewal. A whole, as John and Jesus say, we need to look at the whole world in a different way. We need to change our way of seeing, change our way of thinking. That's what the word we translate repent means. And so John fits exactly the profile of an Old Testament prophet, not seeing the future, no, but looking at the present and saying, if we don't change our way of thinking, there will be consequences. So there's a brief summary of 8th century and Jewish prophecy and that notion of resonance, that the prophets are not in the business of prediction, however much you may find endless videos online saying they were. That's just a misunderstanding of the word. No, the prophets are in the business of confronting people with the present and the implications of the present and inviting them to change their way of thinking, to look differently so that they may fulfill the glorious promise of the covenant between God and his people, a God who will never fail us, will never give up on us, and always desires us to return to him.